What are some of your general observations about how the world is prepared for the age of AI? Is the world ready?
I don't think the world is entirely ready, both at the practical level as well as the intellectual level. I think at the intellectual level, there are still unaddressed concerns about how AI impacts jobs, as an example. One of the leading areas in which AI is being implemented at full force is in the military. Just in the last couple of months, there have been major advances, for example, in the testing of unmanned ground vehicles, as well as a number of other AI-powered weapon systems that the Russians have been investing in. And this creates, further fears around, will these systems just become sentient and kill us all at the one extreme? But then even a middle-of-the-road approach to some of this development is, well, do we need to have an international framework that governs the development of these systems and so on? So given the fact that those frameworks don't exist, the conversation doesn't exist, there is a UN group that is charged with talking about and discussing autonomous weapon systems. And they haven't really been able to, over years and years, come to any sort of a tangible conclusion on what approach to take with regards to these weapon systems. All of this speaks to the fact that there are many opinions, many national interests, and those national interests and opinions have not yet coalesced to a level that would allow preparation, in the global sense. So I can give you many other examples, but I would just say that even these two are sufficient to cite in making the case that I believe there's a lot more that needs to be done for us to prepare well.
What are some of the biggest challenges? You have mentioned already AI weapons. Is this, in your opinion, the biggest threat, or are there other things that might pose a great challenge to us?
I don't think that AI weapon systems are the greatest threat, partly because there's two types of fears, broadly around AI weapon systems. One, that these systems will become like the Terminator, will develop some level of intellectual capacity and this fundamental malevolence. I don't think really we need to build machines to come up with the most unbelievable kinds of malevolence. The human race is sufficient for that. We've shown that throughout our history. So sophisticated technology in the hands of a highly malevolent individual is plenty scary. I don't think that the source of that concern should be the further development of artificial intelligence. But the other type of concern is, well, what if this creates a massive disparity? This is a class of weapon systems that might create some sort of a race. It might create some sort of a fundamental disparity between competitive nations. And therefore, the study of military history shows us that generally stability is achieved when there is some modicum of equality, when there is some parity. And when one competing power is very dominant and another competing power is very weak, that creates reasons and it gives impetus to instability and war and confrontation and so on. So maintaining parity is an important theme. And in AI, particularly AI weapon systems, I think the risk is that on the one hand, certain countries are approaching this with vim and vigor and speed and making large investments, and certain other countries are not. And therefore, that disparity that may result may in fact seed a new kind of instability. During the nuclear age, during the Cold War, there was this idea, sad as it was, of mutually assured destruction. But mutually assured destruction worked in the sense that all the way to the end of the Cold War, what kept the peace was parity. What kept the peace was this idea of consequences. And where we may see risks emanate from, maybe with this new technology, in this sort of capability gap. That capability gap cannot be allowed to exist, not because one power is inherently better than another power, but because stability requires parity.
What would you recommend to mitigate this problem? Are there any solutions in sight? Are there any countries or any organizations that have been approaching a solution?
There are many organizations who have taken the approach of, for example, regulating these weapon systems in very tight ways. There are other organizations which call for outright bans. There are some countries which are taking a variety of different tactics to delay the onset of such bans. So because this is a complex problem, one would expect with multi-hundred stakeholders, more than 200 states involved in some of these discussions, every avenue of attack, every vector of thought has been applied to this problem. So you see all sorts of thinking. The issue is that, this speaks to something very fundamental about the human condition, which is that we recognize that if there is no parity, there is instability. We recognize that if we gain the advantage, then we get to sort of drive the future to a large extent. So at the very minimum, maintain parity, and if you can, attain an advantage. That fundamental drive, I don't think can be reprogrammed or deprogrammed from humanity in a near-term, over the near-term period. So then one has to be very realistic about this, which is to say that the real threat from AI weapon systems is that they are fundamentally software. When you have a deal with a certain nation and you say, look, don't invest in nuclear technology, and they create these buildings with domes, large construction, they're digging into the sides of mountains. Through satellites and through surveillance aircraft, you can verify whether or not this activity is going on. The development of software, however, cannot be verified in this way. So this notion of trust but verify fails with AI-based weapon systems, because you cannot guarantee that a certain sequence of bits exists nowhere in any computer system in an entire country. That's a fundamentally unverifiable sort of an activity. So when you get to that position where you know that on the one hand you aspire to parity, on the other hand you fear someone else taking on an advantage, and then you are working under conditions where the verification of the presence of that advantage is a difficult problem to solve and well nigh an impossible problem to solve, then you enter into the realm of game theory, where the assumption is that since you cannot verify that the competitor is doing what they tell you that they're doing, which is to comply with whatever agreement they have with you, that they are indeed violating that agreement. And the competitor must know that you are working in that way. So it becomes a game theoretic sort of an approach, which leads to its obvious outcomes. In our book, Hyperwar, we talk about this in depth also. But this is unfortunately just the reality. So it's one thing to take a moral position and say, look, weapons are bad, and therefore we must ban all weapons. Of course, weapons can cause harm, and if we could in fact ban all weapons and there was a practical way to go about doing that, perhaps that would be the thing to do, but that is not practical. And what is practical right now is to create stability. And creating stability will require large-scale competitors to make the right sorts of investments and to create a very obvious case for parity and therefore stability.
What about one of the key differences between AI weapons versus nuclear weapons is that nuclear weapons are very difficult to build, whereas AI weapons like drones, you can build one with a few $100s and some spare time. How do you see small actors come into this picture?
See, I mean, if you think about this as a military strategist, the purpose of an AI weapon system and the purpose of a nuclear weapon system are very different. The only case in which nuclear weapons have been used was not for a tactical victory or to clear some embankment or to deal with an armored column. It was to break the will of a nation. That is the strategic use of nuclear weapons. AI weapons of the type that you were describing, the tactical weapons, for a few $100s, yes. In fact, in the Middle East right now, with all the confrontation that's going on there, there are rebel groups that have put together the weapons of the type that you were describing. There have been assassination attempts. There have been successful strikes against airports at great distances. There have even been cases of drones being flown into the radar arrays of anti-missile batteries, and those anti-missile batteries have been taken down for brief moments in time, while a ballistic missile, also kind of a homegrown ballistic missile, has been timed to arrive at the scene while the drone has taken out the radar of the anti-missile battery. So these sorts of sophisticated, orchestrated attacks across multiple actions and with multiple systems, these have actually happened now. These are not the realm of fiction. So the risks that emanate from that kind of technology today are definable. But your point is well taken, which is, where will this go? In general, if you think about weapon systems, the trend is towards precision. Because if you go back to World War II, and if you've seen any documentaries about World War II where they show huge numbers of bombers flying in and dropping large numbers of bombs to take down a bridge or to take down a single building, the reason why you needed huge numbers of bombers with large numbers of bombs was because you didn't have accurate gun sights. You didn't have any kind of geolocation on the weapon system. That was all replaced by a single 2,000-pound bomb. You can take out a bridge with a single 2,000-pound bomb. So instead of flying in 50 bombers and 100 bombers and losing a lot of people and creating mass damage in the area where the bombing campaign was happening, you just drop one bomb, you take out the bridge. That trend of reducing the amount of kinetic firepower and increasing the amount of precision, that trend is generally continuing in military technology. And with artificial intelligence, one of the things that could happen is that you could create far more precise systems, which are even less kinetically powerful than what is being used now. And instead of taking on, for example, an armored division, you might take out 23 very specific people within that armored division at no loss of life to anyone else, again, collapsing the will of that fighting unit. So this is the thinking around a lot of these concepts is not fully developed. But the potential for the use of artificial intelligence to actually reduce casualties in war also exists, even in the kinetic case. Now, we'll see in the fullness of time where these technologies go. But my point here is only that this is not a black and white issue. This is not a 0 or a 1 issue. There is much nuance in this topic. And I don't believe that those who are writing the rules or hope to write the rules understand fully the nuance that they need to in order to effective legislation or the construction of treaties and so on and so forth.
Yeah. What about some of the other types of disruption that can be caused by AI? Like most of us work day to day on things that seem much more benign than weapons, like recommender systems, various types of pattern recognition. How much of a disruption do you see happening from these benevolent systems?
So Yaka, in my office, I have my computer in front of me, and on my left there's a wall, and on that wall there is a poster that shows well over 100 different cognitive biases that the human mind suffers from. These cognitive biases are actually well known. You can go and you can Google and look up a list of these cognitive biases. There are also ways in which you can analyze text, for example, and categorize people's personalities. Ocean is well known. There are many other techniques. And so we know that we succumb to these cognitive biases. We know that the study of these cognitive biases has been formalized. We know that there's ways to, at distance, simply with automatic analysis, NLP, if you will, we can categorize people into various different profiles, and we can gauge their susceptibility to some or all or a few of these cognitive biases. And then, where natural language generation is being used for various other things, natural language generation can also be used to induce the cognitive bias and push a person in a direction where a pre-designed outcome can be realized with a high probability. When you do this at scale, you are talking about essentially the intentional reprogramming of large numbers of people. This is something that in the sentient machine I refer to as mind hacking. It's definitely one of the greater threats. The reason for it being a great threat is because to this audience, you will get this 100%. Building a system like that is neither very expensive, nor is it impossible, nor is it very technically complex, because you can take a lot of the piece parts from various different sources. I was at the Computer History Museum, which for me is sort of like a pilgrimage every time I go there. But one of the holy artifacts, at that temple is one of the original Google, server racks, where you had the sort of off-the-shelf motherboards on these trays with the batteries in the back, which reduced the cost of delivering cloud-based services. With that kind of innovative thinking, if you think about how you can, on an inexpensive level, create physical capacity that can run a system like this, then one could imagine even small groups can conduct large-scale, even nation-level attacks of this type. I don't know that there is a full recognition of that threat, and I don't know that those who are tasked with protecting us against such attacks, that those organizations formally exist, and in the absence of the formal existence of such organizations, whatever the closest proxy organization is, has the level of skill and understanding to be able to detect and defeat such threats. So this is just one example, of course. Another one which I've actually started the process of writing my second book. And one of the, I'm sort of giving this away a little bit, but one of the core tenets of that is that we are past the age where there can be a willful disconnect from technology. There was a time when you could say, I'll turn off my phone and I'll turn off my network connection and I'll go, just be off the grid. My submission is that there is no off the grid anymore. As sensor technology has become more and more complex and fused sensor analysis using machine learning becomes provedly more and more successful, even you walking through a collection of air molecules at distance exhibiting a gate, having a conversation inside a room with a glass window, using a mechanical typewriter, and I give all these examples in the opening chapters of the book, are completely susceptible to signature analysis, detection, reverse engineering at distance. So your existence is a signature. Your existence emanates information into everywhere you are and beyond. And the sensor complexity is such now that signature can be extracted. And what can be extracted can then be used to predict. We're entering a world where disconnection may not be possible. So these types of threats are to be taken quite seriously.
Even if you personally go off the grid, the world around you is still profoundly impacted by technology and AI.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what are some of the approaches that you would recommend for mitigating these risks? Either would that be regulation? Would that be like some technology that would self-regulate AI?
I think that second case that we just spoke about, I do believe that in that area, AI is the best way to deal with AI, adversarial AI. And the way you would do that is, again, this concept of AI shields, where you want to be able to detect AI-driven messages, AI-driven behaviors, and to be able to foil them. There's some work happening now in being able to detect deepfakes, as an example. That, to me, is very basic work, because it's essentially an image or a sequence of images compiled together as a video, and you're trying to detect whether this is machine-made. When you get into more complex media with language and other things layered on, that detection may become more difficult. But those AI shields are, I think, very important to develop on the one hand. Secondly, in the area of regulation, the Department of Commerce, the US Department of Commerce, recently solicited comment on what should we do to regulate the export of certain types of AI. And we're at a very basic stage. So my submission to them was that, first of all, instead of talking about AI, we should really talk about the data, the algorithms, and the models. And then, of course, the underlying hardware infrastructure, like really sophisticated sensors, high-end computing equipment, things like that are enablers. So if you go down the path of regulating algorithms, or if you go about thinking of AI as a category of software, I think that it creates many impossibilities, because to say I'm going to export control AI is like saying I'm going to export control mathematics. It's not possible. So the idea here is that there are already laws that govern the exportability of data. To the extent the data is export controlled, any algorithm that processes that data to produce a model that uses the export controlled data, the model and the data should be export controlled. But the AI products that embody the algorithms, those themselves are like the mathematics. Sort of like, again, don't export differentiation to such and such parts of the world. Very hard to do. So that's sort of this nuanced approach of going in and saying, look, please stop talking about AI. Let's start talking about specific things, and then let's create security and safety around those things. Those are two ideas that I would share with you. AI shields, the detection of AI-generated content and AI-generated campaigns, and also this kind of nuanced regulation that allows commerce by allowing the exportability of products and doesn't prevent American companies from facing what we faced earlier. We export control drones. Other countries were able to sell those drones with those capabilities to 8 or 9 states which were otherwise American customers. We export controlled computers, personal computers, above a certain MIPS threshold. Until in the Clinton presidency, that limit was removed. That caused computers and processors that were built in Far East Asian countries to be exported to the rest of the world. And the consequence was the entire PC industry shifted to that part of the world. The PC industry was really based in Texas. You had Dell, you had Compaq, you had CompuAdd, you had all the high volume companies were out of Texas. That's, outside of Dell, that's all gone. And we know where it went to. So I don't think that mistake needs to be made again.
Yeah. What are some of the countries that are best prepared for to face the future? And is this even something that individual countries can face themselves?
You know, I was recently in the UAE, and in the UAE, and this is, I mean, I go there very frequently. There's a young gentleman who's been appointed the world's first minister for AI. His name is Umar Sultan Al Olama. He is the UAE's Minister for Artificial Intelligence. He's a very forward-looking person, and he's focused heavily on education-related activities with AI and very practical uses of AI. They've got very specific national goals, which is that they want to incorporate autonomous AI-driven decision-making and execution within government to really power the next wave in their e-government, digitization. They are working on, again, tangible, defined, specific projects. I think that's one approach. It starts from, again, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively smaller country, but commensurate with that, a set of goals that are realistic and achievable. And I think they've got the right kind of people behind that. I've spent a lot of time in talking to NATO officials, had several conversations in Brussels. The problem there is that, and that again is one of the examples of the military implementations of AI, and there the problem is that the conventional Western militaries are configured in a way where procurement is very, very difficult. It spans multiple years. And at a time when procurement spans multiple years and you have a technology like AI, which is maturing so quickly and competitors are so incented to create a competitive differentiator, there's this danger of these organizations being left behind, whether it's NATO or DoD or MOD in the UK. And in each one of these cases, I've had extensive conversations. China is moving at speed. I've had many interactions there. I think they have a large number now of AI startup companies. They've got a greater availability of capital. In general, things seem to happen faster. From inception to launch, from launch to the first product, from launch to getting a team of 100 people going. All of these practical things that one has to do to build value or to launch a project or to get from A to B, it's just objectively measurable. Those things are happening faster. So I think right now we're in a position where the world is looking at these technologies in various different ways. Russia has a very military-focused view. China has a very pan view across economy and military. Countries like the UAE have a very specific view of AI as to what it can give them. It's fascinating. I think many countries are realizing that what McKinsey said in their report, about AI, which is that AI might be the first technology that if you adopt it at sufficient scale, it may create advantages which are unassailable. Because essentially you use data, you create a model, you get insight. Using that insight, you then improve your business. You then use a better model to start creating even better data. And this becomes an upward spiral. And then the exponential benefits of being higher up in that spiral are such that if somebody starts too late, you're running at a completely different rate of speed. It's very difficult to catch up.
Mm-hmm. What about things like jobs displacement in the age of AI? Do you have any thoughts or recommendations about that?
Yeah. Look, my view has been for a long time here that the disconnect really should only be on one topic, which is the timing over which the displacement will occur. People can have different views of that because you can calculate that in various different ways. There are lots of complex economic variables that play into that. And the end state, what percentage unemployment will that end state result in? You can have some disconnect on that. But I think a logical person can't have a disconnect fundamentally, that over some period of time, T, there will be some employment, E, where E is substantially greater than the present unemployment, And if you think about this problem in this way, then the fact that you need to come up with a solution is obvious. One of the ways to come up with that solution is to say, okay, well, all this technology and all this autonomous capability is producing something. It's producing something of value that's adding something to the economy. There are ideas around taxing that production and sharing that wealth with the folks who are no longer working. There is the idea that perhaps what you need to do is you need to take some core resources, land in a country, or some core resource in a country, and say, look, all of the citizens of this country own this percentage of that core resource. So as you build anything, you build a factory, you build whatever it is, the percentage of that core resource that you use, you've got to pay the share of the ownership of the citizens in using that resource. There's universal basic income, which is now being tried in various different places. All of these things essentially lead to the same idea, which is that we will have to start paying people without them doing the work to make the money, net. And that also creates this different idea of your relationship with money, right? So conceptually, the way I look at it is I say, okay, well, the human condition has evolved from where 100% of your time was being spent just trying to somehow stay alive. And then that diminished and you got time to do a few other things. But at this point in time, can we not please just get food and basic health? With the level of technology that we have now in the world, is that too much? To just get food and basic health and maybe some education? Okay, so, you can look at that and you can say, well, that's, a dastardly idea, but it's no different to how other types of enablement has been supplied to humanity over time as technology has sort of progressed. I think it's more this notion of, this concept gets caught up in politics. It's really not a very political concept. It's just, we have a bunch of stuff here. If we were to distribute that in a decent way, these basic needs could be met. And let's talk about competition at a level of need that's higher than these basic needs. Some level of free redistribution, some level of redistribution is absolutely necessary. I don't even think that needs to be a debate.
How do political leaders view these ideas? Is it something that they're very reluctant to adopt, or are there differences in different parts of the world?
It's very interesting. If you look at the UK, there's certain types of services that they want to provide, where even a conservative in the UK would want to provide a certain level of service, say in health, that a conservative in the US would consider, disastrous. So on specific topics, as you bring up the conversation, okay, do people deserve some basic health care? Should we allow a person to live when they are ill and they can't pay that bill? What should we do? Should we kick them out of the hospital? Should we, if the society is collectively rich enough, should we allow for that person to live? Okay, that's the basic question. Similar things around, whether we allow them to eat and so on. And ultimately, the one lesson that I've learned in my study of human history is that all people are the same in the following way. That if you take 100 or 1,000 people from Canada and a similar number from Australia and a similar number from Nigeria and so on, and you subject them to roughly the same conditions, you will over time see the same behaviors. Now, this doesn't apply to one person because one person is not statistically significant. And what if that person is Jesus Christ, who always does the right thing, or Muhammad, or Krishna, or whoever? But the thing is that in a large collection of people, it's generally the same thing. So in that sense, if all people are equal, what brings about the worst in people is when you stress them. You're not going to get food. There's this lion coming. It's going to eat you up. There's this other group of people coming. They're going to throw stones at you and, whatever that is, take over your land. That is when people are their ugliest. The human condition, by the way, is that today in every way. There's no change. When you create that level of stress, we revert to what we fundamentally are. So, the solution in my mind is to remove the fundamental stressors that create the greatest amount of instability in society. That is something that we all want. I have 3 boys in school. I fear sending them to school because of everything that's happening. These things do impact all of us. All of us have loved ones and families, and for ourselves, there is an impact. So to me, this is not about some irresponsible socialism and throwing money to people who aren't worth anything. It's actually about creating stability in society, and that does benefit me. And there's a modicum of that stability that one should consider funding. Now, you don't have to provide them opulent mansions, but yes, food and perhaps a stay at the hospital when they're dying. That might be a good start.
Do you think people themselves, I think right now, many of us derive a lot of our meaning from our work, regardless of what we do almost. Do you think this change of attitude towards work is something that can happen within, say, a generation?
I think that change in attitude is already happening. I was just actually talking to a friend of mine here in the Valley last night. And we were talking about just over the last 18, 20 years when, he and I started our careers versus the attitudes that we see towards work now with the current generation. And if you talk to, say, if I talk to my parents, they would tell me that, well, between you and us, there was a change in the attitude towards work. The thing is that at some stage we said work is everything we are, to the point where I'm going to just name my child Ben Farmer, right? I'm just going to call his last name what he does, and painter, and blacksmith, and etc., and goldsmith. These are names. So the job became the identity. And the point is that the unique characteristic of a human being is not the fact that they are a painter or a goldsmith. It's the fact, or that they can produce economic output. That's not the unique characteristic of a human being. The unique characteristic of a human being is that they can discover undiscovered knowledge and perceive it. There is no other such thing that we know of that can discover undiscovered knowledge and perceive it. Now, here's some good news, which is that the landscape of knowledge, what I call the ideascape in the sentient machine, is infinite. The amount of ideas that are out there to be discovered are infinite. So this whole notion that, AI will think 1 billion times faster than us, then we will become useless because our minds can't think at that rate of speed. So therefore, what's the point? That whole idea is kind of irrelevant, because what matters in this journey through an infinite landscape of ideas is not speed. Because given any speed, the percentage of that territory that you will cover tends to 0%. You could be walking at 2 miles an hour, or you could be flying at hyper speed. You will uncover 0% of infinity. But what does matter is perspective. So if you think about these perceivers seeded in the landscape of ideas, and you have an AI over here that with its very high rate of speed can bloom like this and discover ideas like this, and you have a human mind over here that at its rate of speed can just pretty much stay where it is, maybe cover a small distance around. The point is not that this AI is running faster. The point is that because of this difference in perspective, this human mind still has value, because it can be at a part of that intellectual landscape that allows it to see something that at any rate of speed, this AI would not get to. It is a matter of perspective, not one of speed. The value is perceiving ideas from a point of perspective. And in that, all humanity has value, even in the age of AI.
Okay, one last question, and then we're going to get to audience question. What would you recommend to Google as one of the leading AI companies to do to help the world transition towards this new age of AI?
I think we are suffering from a collapse in trust. People don't know how AI systems work. People don't know how AI systems are trained. We are all told as consumers that AI systems devour data. This data is being captured from everywhere. This data is being used for everything. There isn't a level of transparency in the industry broadly as to how AI systems are being built. Every day there's a news story about somebody listening to something and there was a human being involved, and accidentally there was a private message sent from one person to another person. And the net result of all of this is that there has been a tremendous collapse of trust. So I believe that Google, of all the players, relatively, is still at a point where it can attempt to rebuild that trust. The first step in rebuilding that trust is transparency. The second step in rebuilding that trust is then education. And I think education of how this works, education of how certain things are done. And a tremendous advantage Google has is the scale of Google is such that it's not like if one or two things that Google does were known to the world, suddenly Google would be under some existential threat. There are so many competitive barriers that over time Google has been able to build as a solid business that one or two things here or there won't make an existential difference. But what will happen is that there will be at least a move towards the restoration of trust. The fact that AI technology is developing, that goes without saying. It's developing very quickly. But I think it needs to develop under conditions of trust and under conditions of explainability. Those are two places where I think Google is uniquely qualified to contribute.
So what was your inspiration when you were creating this book? What were you really trying to accomplish? Like, what is the one message that you'd like to get out to the audience that you're presenting this book for?
The motivation was that I like reading philosophy. I picked up a book, I think it was The Republic, and in reading the first few chapters of The Republic, I realized that all these questions that Plato had been thinking about a long time ago and that I had read at a younger age, and now I'm reading again, these are the fundamental questions. What of us? Where did we come from? What's our worth? What's good and what's bad? And in the age of artificial intelligence, today I don't think we've answered those questions in any greater depth or to any greater measure of satisfaction than at any time in the past, right? So we haven't really made great strides in those core questions where technology has come a long way. And now we are faced with this century of artificial intelligence, this age of artificial intelligence. So I wanted to combine those two things. What is the advent of AI? What does that mean to humanity? And can the advent of AI become a mirror in which we find ourselves, where we ask questions like, AI is going to be so much faster, so does that make us irrelevant? And then we start thinking, well, why would it make us irrelevant, or why wouldn't it? And then we arrive at some conclusions that perhaps answer some deep questions that we've always been wondering since the beginning of time. So the motivation was to combine that sort of philosophical approach with a practical view of where we are now in time and what AI will soon be doing for us.
At a practical level, are there things that Google or Googlers can do to build ethical AI within our products outside of the sort of broader landscape of establishing trust and explainability at more of an individual level or within certain product areas that you would suggest?
Well, I think even at an individual level, like for example, if you're a product manager or you're a senior architect, or you have some ability to influence the design of a product, I think, or you're a UX designer, even certain small clues, even certain small textual explanations, even certain little configuration, options that essentially break down how data is being collected, what kinds of decision making is going on. I'm not saying that you solve the explainability problem in terms of black box neural network explainability, but even some cues, some information beyond what's present today. Because if you look at a lot of these products today that use a lot of data, there is no one place where you can go and just get the spiel, like, what are you doing with my stuff? That's not hard to do. I think at an individual level, yes, indeed, UX designers, programmers, team leads can push for that. And they can say, look, what's the problem with a single place where it just says, this is what I do, and here's where you can turn things off. Not the config page where you've got 4 things that you can turn off, but then you find out in 3 articles 3 months later that there were also 4 other things that weren't in the software. Now there's going to be an update that will contain 2 more of those buttons. It just creates a condition of a mistrust where it seems to the consumer that, oh, they got caught out, then they added half of what they needed to add. Just one place that just says, here's what I do, period. Even small things like that in the design, little cues, that is explainability of a very practical type. It's not the holy grail of AI explainability, but at least it explains something to the user beyond what they know.
So I don't fear being killed by a machine, but I fear being killed by a human being as a gay man after being recognized by a machine that I'm a gay man in a country where homosexuality is being punishable. Is there any way that you think it will be possible in the future to prevent things like that to happen?
Let me be very honest. Artificial intelligence is not a solution for human malevolence. However, human malevolence is magnified in conditions of stress. Artificial intelligence is a way to reduce stress. You can certainly diminish the chances. You can certainly lessen the places where such violence is wantonly carried out. But I'm not here to tell you that artificial intelligence can cure the human condition. And I use those 2 words very carefully.
Hi. So on one side, public trust is important, what we are doing with people's data. And on the other side, you also mentioned parity. And so not all countries would be working with the same constraints, and they can probably take bigger strides towards it. So which one should we choose?
So I don't think that there's an either or there. There are consumer systems, there are military systems. Okay, so what I'm talking about explainability in is the kind of explainability that I was addressing earlier is in consumer systems. Parity is a concept around military technology, and in military technology, generally, I don't know that many people will complain if you, for example, develop visual models of an open T-72 hatch or a T-90 hatch. I don't think that's going to be a privacy issue. But if you take data and start shipping it across the network and it's not clear where it's going and people still aren't sure whether they said, the name of some perfume and then they suddenly saw the ad connected with that perfume. Was it listening? Was it not? I'm talking about those sorts of things. So I think these are 2 different domains and there are different standards involved. Parity is in the military domain, and I don't think you're going to have consumers complaining again about visual databases of military assets. So the mind hack, again, I feel that you can't just, it's sort of like saying a criminal is going to commit a bad act like theft, and you should pass a law to say that theft is bad. Well, that law already exists. So the issue is not so much the passage of the law. The issue is, do you have effective technology to prevent that? Do you have a police force? Do you have faster cars than the thieves have, and so on? There, I think you're talking about AI shields. The idea behind mind hacking is that you have computer-generated content that's being used to divert people in ways that is wrong in some form or fashion. You need to detect and stop that. Our law enforcement, the networks themselves, none of these companies or organizations currently have that level of technology. It needs to be developed and invested in.
So we're talking about kind of auxiliary effects on people, sort of auxiliary effects of AI. But I'm wondering, what is your kind of view of the day-to-day impact of AI on people's lives?
So, obviously that question is tied to the day-to-day use of AI in people's lives. I have a 5.5-year-old. At one level, I think the level of interaction that he has with a lot of these personal assistants is at an emotional level. I can see that. In fact, the other day I was asking him, I said, what would you like, the personal assistant to do? And I said, well, I've already thought of the next personal assistant. And he came up with a name for it. He said, the difference between this and the current personal assistant is that it'll be able to come out of the box. And when I say clean my room, it won't just give me an answer. It'll actually come out of the box and clean my room. So there's a lot going on there, right? There's a lot going on there. He's thinking about the fact that actually there is a physical presence, but it's just that the manufacturers of the device have not created the right door yet from which that physical presence comes out. So now that's quite something. That's quite something. Because he doesn't believe in magic. He doesn't believe in Deus ex machina. He believes that men can create things like that. Possibly the first generation that thinks that. And their relationship with this technology is going to be very, very different. I think the legislation that these guys, the 5.5-year-olds, will get into 20 and 30 years down the road will be very different. And a lot of the resistance, I think, and this is also the age-old story of human history. Sometimes people just need to age and move on before the next set comes in and runs the world the way that they want to run. So in that sense, and it's just one very small example. I don't want to bore everyone with very many others, but that's profound.
So you were talking about parity in the military area, but I was thinking that, and you kind of touched on that when you said that there's this report that says if certain companies don't start using AI right now, they might be out of the game forever. But I was thinking that if we apply this to different countries, that's a different problem that you probably didn't touch that much on, and it is the fact that different countries are in different stages of economical evolution. And can you comment on that? What happens if just some of the countries, and this is what is happening right now, will use the AI while others just cannot?
Yeah. So this has always happened across human history and military history. And the solution to that is called alliances. Because essentially, for example, there was nuclear technology, the Soviets had it and the Americans had it, right? And the rest of the world was seeking nuclear umbrellas from one or the other. That desire to seek nuclear umbrellas resulted in the Warsaw Pact on the one hand and NATO, CETO, CENTO, Baghdad Pact on the other. So those are the types of things that are constructs that deal with the reality that while the underlying phenomenon of parity can only be maintained between certain players, those players then are the dominant players, and everybody else must be part of an ecosystem, right? So by the way, that works in technology also. When a platform takes off and adopts a level of scale that's beyond a certain level, and it's hard to deal with it, as a small ISV, as a small game developer, whichever platform you want to pick, what option do you have? You want to launch an independent game. How many people are brave enough to just go off on their own and create their own platform? You got to deal with the platform guys, right? Now you can choose whether platform A or platform B, but the chances of you creating a third platform while you're essentially a game developer are 10 to 0. By the way, these are patterns that apply to everything in life. Here's the other thing. This is a very meta sort of a thing. The idea of dominance being owned by a small set within a network, then nodes coalescing around one or the other. This fundamentally in physics is called gravity.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Amir. This was a fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time.
Thank you very much, Yaka, and thank you very much.